as Karl Marx famously said, amongst other economists, amongst other philosophers, economics is what drives world history. And if you don't believe me, just think if we had this event 30 years ago, would China have featured so many times on your top 10? I doubt it. What made China what it is today is economic development. So the question is, where is Europe going? And what do we see in the economy? Well, Europe is really in a kind of unique situation, if you like, because of the strong shocks that are taking place. If any one of the shocks that we're observing in Europe now took place in isolation, we would have had difficulties in how to adjust to them. But we've had at least 4 or 5. You know, we had the ongoing one, which is going to continue, is the digitalization of production with automation technologies, what the World Economic Forum and others are calling the fourth industrial revolution. We've had COVID-19 accelerating that process, but also upsetting it in some other ways. We have the war in Ukraine that you heard a lot about. I don't need to say more about that, the deterioration in the geopolitical situation. We had the rise in energy prices, which have accelerated the need for greener policies, and we've had much bigger awareness of the risks from climate change, especially from consumers, and of course ultimately it's consumers that drive the market. Now these changes have brought, these shocks if you like, have brought a lot of changes at the workplace, and not much has been done currently either by companies or governments to accommodate them, and we do need a lot more. In fact, if you look back at history, the only time that we observe this kind of change at the workplace is probably associated with the initial stages of an industrial revolution, like when there is that big movement from agriculture into industry and urbanization and so on. I think they're comparable to that kind of change. You know, what China experienced in the 1990s and 2000s, for example, is what we are seeing, but not in terms of population movements. Now, let me list some of those changes that are taking place in the workplace. Well, first of all, jobs need to adapt to digital technologies if they're going to survive. Those require different skills than previously possessed. The education system needs to adjust to accommodate them. But even more importantly, both companies and workers need to change the way they approach work. Secondly, COVID-19 has made us aware of the importance of public health. This is another item that is entering companies' planning decisions. COVID-19 also introducing new technologies that enable remote working, which I believe is going to remain. In fact, my 11th forecast of what's going to happen in 2023 is that at least 1/5 of work will be done from home, although COVID will not be a problem anymore. Now, third, company directors need to start thinking about the green transition if they haven't already, both in their own companies, but also in the creation of new companies that will bring about more effective and greener ways to generate energy. The recent rise in energy costs has given an extra impetus to this trend, but we need to do a lot more. For example, if we're going to electrify much more than we have now, if we're going to use renewable resources, we need people to carry out this transitional work, and we don't really have enough. And finally, one that I think is very important and didn't get any mention up to now, consumers are becoming aware of both health and climate change. They're switching their purchasing habits in items such as food, in what vehicles they drive, and their shopping methods, moving online. I recently took part in a very interesting conference on the food industry, the biggest one taking place, in fact, internationally. And what everyone was saying is that how they have to switch their production and marketing because of consumers becoming much more selective. In fact, if you're surprised, you're already seeing it now. I mean, just a year or 2 years ago, when would you see numbers next to an item on a menu that tells you about allergens? That's a new thing, and that's because of consumer awareness that a lot of foods are allergic. Now consumers are now switching to to the contents of foods, to the health, because of the public health awareness, but at the same time on whether those foods are produced in organic ways, whether the chemicals are being used. we haven't adapted to that changes yet, but it's accelerating. Then governments need to regulate these things. They need to require companies to respond to the consumer drive for much more climate-friendly production. Now, how can we achieve this at the company level? Because after all, we live in a capitalist system, and that's good for us, don't get me wrong. Mentioning Karl Marx and capitalism with the same breath. How are companies going to succeed in bringing this about? Well, economists for about 60 years now have been talking about workers as human capital, which encourages people to think of workers the way they think about machines. You know, they're an expense item, they're productive, use them in that productive way, but pay them as little as possible, as little as you can get away with it. I think that's completely wrong. It's changing. You can see the strikes taking place now in Britain, for example. It is part of that change that is going on, and I'm very supportive of that change. And if not necessarily what's going on in Britain, but definitely of the change. Now, and the idea here is that companies cannot carry on treating their workers as an expense item to be used only when it yields productivity, just like they treat their capital equipment. Workers become stakeholders in the pursuit of company objectives, such as health and the integration of automation technologies. And when I mentioned what we are seeing now in the health industry, for example, nurses, doctors, ambulance drivers, and so on, should be stakeholders in the provision of health, not people who are controlled by the state in terms of the payments and they go into conflict. Now, good work has certain features that make workers more productive. They improve their well-being, and that gives companies a better public image and gives companies a bigger role in society. Perhaps the most important feature of good work is more worker autonomy, more involvement in the planning of company policy, and more frequent exchanges of ideas with line managers and directors. The company needs to give more information to workers about going on in the workplace, invite them to think about their role in the company, and make suggestions about adapting their role to improve efficiency. Workers know best what they're good at, so let them choose how they can best use their skills in the company. I only have 1 more minute. Parts of this process is the training that workers have access to. Good jobs provide opportunities for ongoing training in these digital technologies, for example, with workers having an input in the selection of training programs. In other words, they own their training. The McKinsey Global Institute have recently published some research that shows that companies that offer the possibility of at least 75 hours of training per year do much better than other companies in the labor market. Many other features contribute to good work. Important among these is better work-life balance. Do companies offer more flexible working hours and environment to enable workers to give more time to life events whenever they occur, like childcare? Does the company pursue diversity and inclusion? Is it actively pursuing policies to reduce greenhouse emissions and switch to healthier forms of energy? These are very big challenges, and we have taken only small steps in that direction. We have come through a severe recession. I don't think we're going to experience more of this. I think inflation is coming down. We're coming out of the recession. And it's not a justification for not doing more in the direction that I pointed out. We're still struggling with various things. You know, I agree entirely that Britain is a country that is worse off now because of Brexit and political instability. I mean, you talked about changes of government in Bulgaria. There have been even more in Britain. They need to support more public sector workers if we are going to, if they're going to progress, and I don't see it happening before the next election. But I'm much more optimistic about Europe, and I think it's time that we switched to the digitalization of our economies, engaging workers a lot more, because that's where the future lies, and making sure that the green transition commitments that we have given are carried out.